Welcome everyone to the final panel of this year's edition of International Placemaking Forum Mannheim. My name is Matthias Rauch. I'm Head of Cultural Innovation and Creative Economy here at Next Mannheim, and I am delighted to be your host for this session. Today we want to talk about community building and the governance of placemaking with fabulous speakers. I'm really looking forward to the discussion. We're going to start out as usual with a brief keynote of about 20 minutes, and then we're going to enter the discussion. And I'm going to introduce the speakers after the keynote. As always, please, if you have any questions, do not hesitate to post your questions or remarks either in the Q&A section or directly in the chat. And I will do my best to integrate them into the discussion. So please, any questions, any remarks, feel free to participate in the discussion. I'm absolutely delighted and honored to introduce our keynote speaker for this session, Tom Borup. Dr. Tom Borup is founder of Creative Community Builders. Tom is an international consultant and lecturer working with cities, foundations, and nonprofits to develop synergy between arts and culture, economic development, urban planning, and design. His latest book, The Power of Culture in City Planning, was published by Routledge in 2021, along with the Routledge Handbook of Placemaking, edited with Kara Courage, who's also been part of the Placemaking Forum, and 5 other contributing editors. Tom's 2006 book, The Creative Community Builders Handbook, remains a leading text for practitioners and students in the field. He earned his PhD in Leadership and Change from Antioch University. Tom is a senior lecturer and director of graduate studies for the University of Minnesota's Master of Professional Studies in Arts and Cultural Leadership. He's a visiting professor in cultural planning with the University of International Business and Economics in Beijing, China, and teaches for Drexel University and the Minneapolis College of Art and Design, as well as for the online PhD program in Arts and Cultural Management at the University of Kentucky. Very warm welcome to Tom Borup. Tom, thanks for being with us. The virtual floor is yours.
Thank you, Matthias. It's great to be here. Of course, I wish I could actually be in Mannheim visiting with you all and learning about your amazing city and sharing more of your program. But here we are in this age of COVID and Zoom. Which we will be with us for some time, but we'll learn to do these things. So I am speaking to you from Minneapolis in the US, and I'm going to share my screen and share some images and so on with you. If I get this. So the title of my talk today is Community Building and the Governance of Placemaking. And I'm speaking, as I said, from Minneapolis, Minnesota, and it's a growing tradition here to acknowledge the land on which we are sitting because of the rampant colonialism that has created the places that we now live in, and we have to live with the good and the bad. But these lands are the traditional, ancestral, and contemporary lands of indigenous people, specifically the Sisseton and Wahpeton bands of the Dakota. I'd like to acknowledge the complex and layered history of this place. And as someone dedicated to cultural, creative, and place-based work, it is important to recognize, support, and advocate for American Indian nations and peoples. I'd also like to acknowledge that men and women were forcibly taken from their ancestral lands in Africa, uprooted their culture, and forced to build the infrastructure of the country in which I live, where I have benefited from these generational and genocidal traumas. And some of the work we do continues to be healing some of these scars. So I wanted to share that with you, and sorry I was reading all of that text, but it's an important thing for us to do in the States, for sure. So I was asked to talk today about 3 basic things, and they may seem a little disparate, but I hope I draw the connections between them. The first one, the roles and patterns of or best practices for arts and culture and community building, and the governance structures for community building and placemaking. And finally, just touch on changes resulting from the global pandemic and some of the challenges and contributions that culture and arts and the artists have made as we emerge, assuming we emerge from this pandemic. So my goal, and I think many of the people that I work with and work for, are to create equitable and resilient communities. That's succinct, but not easy to do, of course. And part of the reason that's not easy to do is that the dominant planning and development practices not only separate uses, as in land use, zoning, and so on, which is predominant in the States, but I think I've seen it in all parts of the world. It separates uses, but also separates people, and separates us in ways that can be increasingly difficult to overcome. And we see that separation then extending into the social, political, and other arenas. So some of the things we know, and just to start out with some of the foundation here, that the focus on creative cities, creative class, arts districts, culture-led regeneration, there are many ways, creative placemaking, one of the more recent sort of terms. These present opportunities, but also challenges. And from what we have seen, most work in this area has contributed to growing economic inequity and social division. I mean, even Richard Florida, who was a big proponent of creative class and so on, has more recently said, "Whoops, look what happened." And he's tried to address some of the impacts of what has happened from this creative class attraction work. So I also want to lay out how I define some of the terms that I'm using. And one, of course, is culture. And many people snap to sort of what's sometimes called opera house culture, high art or whatever when you use the term culture. But in the more anthropological way and in a sort of community setting, it's our ways of living together. It's how we share our space, our things, and how we work together and do things and make things together as people. And of course, that's increasingly complex in more diverse and as international migration takes place. So the other thing I want to assert, and you'll see more of that through my talk, are that artists who we think of as providing decoration, entertainment, making special things happen, they do more than that. They can do more than that. Not all artists, and I'll share a little on that, but I see, and in my work, I have worked with many artists in a lot of different capacities, and they are leaders who are present every day in everyday places, and they are integral and can be integral in every step of the work that we do in terms of city making, placemaking, addressing all kinds of social issues. So I'm no art historian per se. I've been around working in this business for 40 some years, and just, you know, there's a variety of creative practices that are fairly traditional and these Western art forms that we've come to know, and there are also ways of participating in them, consuming them, making them, and so on. And then just my sort of simple chart, if you will, of some of the ways that they're practiced. They're formal or informal, vernacular or mass or popular, institutional-based art practices or community-based art practices, etc. And when we look at these various ways of practicing, I think of the ones that should have turned into black text here as being the kinds that can be transformative, that artists who work in these ways in whatever art form, music, dance, theater, etc., make a difference in our communities in some practical ways. And these are artists, as I said, I've worked with, and you'll see some images of some of them at work. And the other premise that I start with are that communities that possess this greater sense of social capital or cohesion and a collective capacity for collective action are more resilient, better able to address collective interests. And this is really important as we move into the growing global crises that we're experiencing, is to have that sense of cohesion and collective action for people to work together to overcome their issues. And again, urban planning, community development, these other standard professions don't adequately address the building of social capital and civic capacity. In fact, some people that I've worked with, city planners and others, they're not really too fond of communities that have a lot of social capital or capacity, because they then come into conflict with the changes that the planners want to make in communities, and the communities can sometimes resist because they have that greater collective capacity. And so the first thing I was asked to speak about, I'll talk about briefly, these roles, patterns, and best practices of art and culture and community building. And artists and a lot of different creative and cultural practices that I described can animate places and be integral to the process of planning, design, building community, and so on. And the one other sort of foundational approach that I use in my work is building on the assets and unique qualities of every place and of the people. So it begins with recognizing what are the unique and special qualities, what are the capacities of each individual, and helping to nurture and foster those things. It's a strategic approach to overcoming challenges or problems, because what do you have to work with? Well, you have to look at your assets as to what you have to work with in order to then overcome the challenges in a community. So one of the foundational practices that I use in going about doing that is cultural asset mapping. And this is working together with people to find the meaning and to build that sense of community or social cohesion. It's a way of engaging voices, activating creative practices in the work, and for communities to self-define their culture. And for those of us from the outside or professionals in this work to better understand communities. And I find that in making art together, when people are practicing some kind of creative practice in a community setting, it helps to build on that sense of creative capacity that people have to work together. So there are many different ways of mapping, per se, and engaging people in a process of better understanding and engaging in their community through, I see community planning, cultural planning, or city planning really as being fundamentally community organizing. So again, it's about finding the cultural richness and creativity in every person and every place. And it can also be a lot of fun when people get engaged in doing some of that work. So just a summation on this participatory cultural asset mapping. It is a way to reveal community values and visions. And it usually within the community itself, it's self-revealing. It's like, oh, that's what we care about, and that's what we see for our future. And it helps achieve greater consensus when people get in a creative space to do that. Of course, when you reveal some values in communities, you can also create some division or amplify some division. But in my experience, there are always things that you can find that people do fundamentally agree upon, and you build from there. And thirdly, it's finding and reinforcing community identity, which is also important for people to feel a sense of pride of place. And providing experience working together, and when it's joyful, especially with the right artists at the lead in the process, it actually makes community work more attractive as opposed to something people don't want to get involved with. So one of the questions, though, is what are cultural assets? And this, again, is something that each and every community or place needs to wrestle with. That's part of that process of identifying the community values and to see that, oh, okay, these are creative assets, cultural assets that we find important in our community. And they can be arranged. They can be a wide range of different things that different people value and care about. And the other thing very helpful and useful in this work is what has been called the activator effect of culture. I know it's complex. It's not all that simple, but arts, culture, there's creative practices can serve as a vehicle for building what's called horizontal relationships. And I'll talk about that in the next section. And many people have used different language. They call it the propulsive effect or culture as a connecting agent. One of my favorite is that culture is the egg in the batter, not the icing on the cake. Or perhaps it's both sometimes. And that what I've found is that culture can build bridges with little effort in homogeneous communities when people who are pretty much of the same ethnic background and so on, it's like they quickly take to coming together around certain cultural activities. However, in very diverse communities, like the one in which I live and many in the United States and throughout the world, it really requires deliberate and long-term ongoing efforts. Otherwise, you have the reverse effect. You have culture dividing people and not connecting people. So it's very important to understand when it's doing one and when it's doing the other, and finding ways to work with culture as a connective agent. So the second topic that I hope to link ultimately, this governance structures for community building and creative placemaking. What are some of the ways that people have organized themselves? And I'm not going to give you specific examples in this short time, but some basic principles that I've seen in my work. Now, one of the basic organizing principles in sort of our Western culture and society is what we call the silo effect, and it's each profession, each discipline, each different agency of government even putting itself into its own silo or tube. In farm country, we use silo. I don't know if that's common in all parts of the world, but I think you get the idea. And instead of siloizing, if that's a word, finding ways to create horizontal networks is really important. And this is the subject of research that I did a few years ago. And these horizontal networks are formal and informal social structures connecting people across professions, sectors, and different types of people, different ethnic groups, and so on. That's part of the horizontal connections. And some people have called this local relational capital or public platforms of knowledge exchange. These are places and ways of doing things and types of organizing that create the more horizontal networks. So the research I did in a paper called Equity and Resilience, Planning and Developing Horizontal Networks Through Cultural Districts, where I examined a number of cultural districts and the whole phenomenon globally, and found that in this management of cultural districts, that the horizontal networks built on social capital and contributed in these places to resilience. In other words, there were changes afoot that were affecting these districts and these areas of cities. And those that had horizontal networks through their organizational structures were able to retain and build upon from inside their communities to build upon the values and the strengths that they had. And the others, where there were more vertical or silo type networks, they were not as resilient, and change was running over them. And when I talk about change, it's the old gentrification, dislocation of low-income people, and so on. They had no capacity to fight that, and the real estate developers and profiteers and so on would find these places attractive and come in, buy up property, push out the artists, and others could no longer afford to be there. So it was that cycle of gentrification that we're quite familiar with. However, the communities with the more horizontal networks were able to sustain themselves better. So the third thing seems a bit afoot, but I think it really connects to changes we're seeing right now in the world through this global pandemic, and how people are responding to these things. So we have to ask, has COVID-19 really changed the world? And also we have to ask, is it just one symptom of climate change and biodiversity collapse, as has been suggested? And does that mean then that it is part of a more ongoing phenomenon that we're going to see manifest in other ways? And I believe more or less it is. But it really, it only accelerated, not only, but one of the things it did was accelerate a lot of change in these other areas. We were already moving into online learning and virtual meetings and conferences, and then boom, the last 2 years, that's pretty much all we do. So there were a lot of acceleration of changes. Now, again, asking, is this a collision, or is it a confluence of factors? And all these factors, these economic transitions, climate change, and the fact that social injustice has been illuminated through much of this phenomenon that we've experienced. And some have suggested, this very recent, the New York Times, we know this already, climate change is increasing global conflict, spurring migration, heightening tension, and so on. Some cities here in Minnesota, like Duluth, have recognized this and said it's a post-industrial city with more capacity for a new population. Is inviting people, climate migrants, come here. We have space, we have jobs, we have things you can do, and climates like that are in the northern parts where they have plenty of water and think that they'll be resistant to climate change. But this is a much larger phenomenon, and where will people go as migration is increased, and the divisions that have been fostered of late, but have been around for a long time. These pictures are from my neighborhood in Minneapolis, not that long ago, and you may be familiar with a phenomenon or an event that happened here just over a year ago, and it was just a few blocks south of where I live, where I'm sitting right now. And it was the murder of George Floyd by police. That's not a new or actually unusual phenomenon, but it was captured on video, and it was horrendous, and it sparked protests far and wide. And as a result, this is looking out the window that is right here, just a few days after George Floyd's murder. And this is just a fraction of the destruction that took place in my part of the city during that time, during those few days. It was quite traumatic to experience, but it also brought out the best. And communities organized quickly and came together and distributed, because the stores and other resources were burned down. So people had nowhere to shop or find food and other necessities, but voluntary groups came together quite spontaneously to supply some of those resources. And artists were what we are now calling first responders. Artists as first responders were all across the community making statements and ultimately helping us make sense of changes taking place and tragedies that we've experienced. So this is one mural in my neighborhood, and certainly George Floyd, his murder made a big impact, but these changes are much larger and have been going on for a long time and will continue to take place, but recognizing that moment of what happened was kind of important. So in wrapping up, there were many changes COVID accelerated, and one we know we need more vibrant, equitable, creative, activated places for living, working, playing, and learning. And that if people are working from home, they're not traveling to the office, or at least as frequently as they were. Office spaces are being vacated and in some cases turned into residential spaces. That had already been happening in downtowns, in the States at least, for some time. So this means that this urban planning and design phenomenon of separating uses and pushing people further apart needs to change. And we need more places that have mixed use, that are about living, working, playing, and learning in walkable communities. And that is really important for in terms of addressing climate change in the long term, if it's not too late, which I'm afraid maybe. So we have to really challenge the traditional city planning and development paradigms. And this is we're in a place where artists are very helpful to us. And I love this quote that I'll kind of end with, that what the map cuts up, the story cuts across. So with our planners mapping our cities, we need our artists to connect us in those same places. And we need the artists to help us think differently. We need to create more horizontal networks, and we need to really put to work the positive side, the activator effects of culture in our communities to connect us and not separate us. So we can't go back to normal. Changes are accelerating, and we have to find new ways, and who better than our artists to help us find new ways of thinking in our communities. And that's my talk. I think I went almost a little bit over time, but I will.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Tom, for this very rich presentation that already touched upon all the issues that we will be talking about in our discussion. Therefore, let me briefly introduce the other two panelists. If you could turn on your video cameras. We have Anita McKeown with us, an award-winning artist, curator, and educator working at the intersection of art, equitable spatial planning and technology, open source culture and technology, ethical and ecological implications, and STEAM education and placemaking across a range of interdisciplinary projects, processes, and partnerships. As Art Services Unincorporated, an itinerant strategic platform, she employs a range of tactics, including situated arts practice, publication, and education to co-create local scale interventions that are context responsive and ecologically sensitive, which arise from extended relationships with people and place. With over 110 exhibitions and performative projects to date, she continues to present her work locally, nationally, and internationally. Moreover, she's co-director of Smart Lab Skelix, a satellite of Smart Lab Research Institute, UCD, and co-director of Smart Lab Academy for the Future. I made it. place-based STEAM and placemaking. Very happy that you can join us, Anita. And last but certainly not least, we have David Engwich from Australia with us. David has over 30 years of experience in placemaking. He's a passionate designer, artist, author, communicator, and social inventor. Best known as the creator of the Walking School Bus. Project for Public Spaces in New York describe him as one of the world's most inventive thinkers on creative, vibrant public spaces. Nothing gives David greater joy than working with communities to breathe new life into dead spaces. He's also the creator of the 7-day makeover, which transforms town centers in just 7 days. We will be talking about this as well. Welcome, David. Great to have you.
Thank you.
Tom, first question I wanted to direct to you, also based on your presentation. You highlighted the importance of participatory cultural asset mapping, which I found very interesting. Could you elaborate a little bit about how this works? What does an average process look like? Who do you talk to? Who do you incorporate? What are the different steps that you go through with regard to cultural asset mapping?
Well, that's a great question, because there's no one way to do it, and every community is different, and working together with the people there to design the process on the front end is also a very important part of that process. So, but oftentimes it may be a city, it may be a local private foundation or activist community group that says we want to invite you in to help us make some change or address some issues, and we start a process of learning together about the community. I mean, I don't like the kind of consultant who just comes in and let me learn and I'll process and tell you what you should do. But instead working together with people to say, how are we going to learn about each other in this community and about the history of this place and so on, and design that process. And at some point, and you saw a few pictures of some of those activities, at some point there's people invited in with some sort of visual large format maps, and using those to interact with and visualize, but importantly, it's about them interacting with each other in that process. So we try to design in ways that they are creating together in small groups and sharing what they've designed and so on. And out of that sometimes comes, in one recent place, we did a publication, beautiful, collected images and stories from many people in the community. A beautiful publication that was distributed that told the story of the community, and that was sourced from people in the community. So feeding back the ideas that are generated in that process is also a very important step in it as well. So those are some of the key points, I hope.
How long does a mapping usually take place? Is this a matter of days or weeks, rather, to get a full cultural mapping?
Well, a full cultural mapping is never ending.
Yeah.
And we sometimes try to build in online platforms or whatever that people can continue to contribute to, so that they get the idea that the culture is changing and new people are arriving and so on, that it is an ongoing thing. It's never static. But I mean, I have done projects in which it is just a few days when people are already ramped up and ready to go and come together and have a big community event and create some kind of a map from which we then distill ideas and learn from. But other times it can take place over a year, when people continue to meet and generate ideas and have multiple events. It depends on the scale of the work they want to do and the budget they have to do it with, of course.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Tom. David, your approach, at least when at first sight, seems a bit more intuitive, since you also offer so-called 7-day makeovers for cities and town centers. Could you talk a little bit about this approach? How does your process look like when you do a 7-day makeover?
All right, I guess our starting point is that most processes are totally bogged down in talk, and we think of community engagement as a talk process. So I guess the evolution of our of the 7-day makeover started many years ago when I was approached by a city council to do a town plan for a village. I asked them what their budget was. They said $50,000. I said, is that my fee or is that for implementation? They said, that's for your fee. I said, how much have you got for implementation? And they said, well, we won't know until you've done your study. And I had an aha moment at that point, which is, I'd seen this happen over and over again, that most authorities will allocate money for a study, but they never tell the consultant how much is they've got in the budget for making something happen. So I said, I refuse to be a fraud on this community and hold a talk fest when I know there's a 99.9% chance that every idea that we come up with will never get implemented because there's no budget allocated to implementation. So I said, let's do a brave experiment. What if I only take $5,000 for my fee? And I put the other $45,000 in the middle of a table and I run a 2-day workshop to help the community come up with the most creative use they can possibly come up with that $45,000. So that's what we did. Now, the end of that story is that the plan that so what we did is in that 2 days, we came up with ideas of how they could use that $45,000. And I put the community into project teams. And I said, okay, go away, get organized, and we'll do a kind of an instant makeover of your village center. Now, the end result of that story is it took them 10 years to implement that plan, because what happened is all communities are addicted to endless committee meetings, they're addicted to a master planning approach, which is we must know what the end product looks like before we can begin, which is endemic in particularly local government areas. So we then trialed a 12-week process where we create what we call the resources bank, which is similar to an asset-based approach where we go, okay, we might have $30,000 from the council. We might run a crowdfunding program, raise another $30,000 from the community, but then we also ask for donations of stuff they got in their garage or up in the attic, whatever, and we create a resources bank. Now, the key to our process is that there is no point of master planning where somebody stands back and goes, this is the best plan for your town centre. What we do is we put people into small groups and we get them to brainstorm the most creative use of the resources in the resources bank to transform their town centre. But I must say something important about this, that there's a prerequisite, which is, and this is what I call informed community doing, as opposed to community consultation or community engagement. And the informed part is really, really important. So I do an audit on the town centre, and I basically teach those people the art of placemaking and what's not working in their town centre, but in like an hour and a half, okay? So when we say what's the most creative use of the resources, they're deciding that on the basis of being informed as opposed to collective ignorance about how their town centre is working or not working. So back to the 12-week process, we had a 12-week process where we'd run the 2-day workshop, we'd get them into project teams, we'd say, you've got 12 weeks to get organised, then we're going to come back and do a sprint, which is implemented in a really short period of time. Now, after a few years of doing that, we reviewed all of the towns that we'd been working in, and what we discovered was that in about half of them, 2 or 3 years later, they were still having committee meetings, and we'd never got to go back to their town to do the implementation. The other thing that would happen is the town naysayers would get organised and go, well, there's no way you're doing that. And they would lobby the local government authority and get the whole thing closed down. So we did the only thing we could do. We chopped the 12 weeks out. We go straight from a 2-day planning workshop into 5 days of making over the town centre. So nobody has time to have a committee meeting. Nobody has, the naysayers don't know what's happening until it's all over. And the whole town centre has been transformed. And we find that incredibly tight time frame, but with a focus on doing, and I should point out that what we say to people in the 2-day workshop is we are not coming up with a master plan for their town centre in that 2 days. What we're coming up with is an agreed starting point. And we say to them that during the 5 days, they must remain flexible to allow the ideas to mature, to grow, to morph. That what comes up in that 2 days is only a starting point. One other key aspect of this approach that I must explain is the way we decide what is going to be done, because obviously there's a million ideas of what could be done. So I've mentioned that we give them the training, the information. We then put them in small groups, and we actually forbid people talking about their ideas prior to this point, because otherwise what you end up with is groupthink about what the solutions are for the town centre. So we forbid talk about my idea is in the big group context. We get people into multiple small groups and we say, we want you to come up with what you think is the most creative use of the resources you've got access to. And then we want you to present that to the larger group in some kind of creative visual form. So we give them plasticine and pipe cleaners and all of that kind of thing, and they make little models or whatever. We then go around and all the groups present their ideas. And here's the magic moment. And this is still in day 1. I say, if you only had 10 minutes to invest in your town centre, what idea did you hear today would you invest your 10 minutes in? And if you're so passionate about that idea, you're prepared to be a driver of that idea to make it happen, come out the front and write the idea on a piece of paper. Then I say to the audience, everybody who wanted to give their 10 minutes to that idea, go and stand with that person. And that's our project groups. We go from ideas to project groups in 10 minutes. Then on day 2, and this is important, what we do is we test the viability of those projects as to whether they can be delivered in 5 days within the resources that we've got. So every team has to come up with a project plan, and then the whole group decides whether a project gets put on hold or whether it goes into production on the morning of the 3rd day of the process. So that's kind of like a sketch, but the whole idea is that this is about informed community doing. I believe that the traditional processes encourage what I call unaffordable wish lists. So we go to communities and we go, what do you want for your community? But that's like asking an architect to design your house. And when they say, what's your budget? You go, well, I don't know until you bring the plan back. That's what we've been doing to communities for decades, which is why they're all pissed off and don't really want to be part of our processes.
So it sounds a bit like urban design thinking to me. It's very iterative. You work with prototypes. Time is a crucial factor. Anita, how do you usually go about when you start into a placemaking project? Are there constants that you always make sure that they're in place, that you always work with? What is your perspective and your approach?
I mean, I think the first thing is really an invitation from someone or somewhere. I now use a very particular approach that is a sort of, it emerged out of ecological design and design thinking, as well as permaculture. A lot of people think of permaculture in food, but it's actually a very agile, creative, dynamic systems approach. And so very much part of what would be a first start is, as others have talked about, the mapping, the audit, the collaborative. I think the idea of informed is a very useful and interesting idea. Often a lot of communities are what some would call high context. So a lot of the knowledge and information, maybe even resources, is implicit. It's not explicit. It's hard. You know, there may be knowledge and resources that are overlooked because they're so familiar almost. And also sort of resources that may be available, but their use may need to be reimagined, or if partnered with other resources or opportunities, could be reimagined. So that's kind of the very, very first stage. And it, you know, begins with observation. It starts to look at boundaries and edges. It looks at the resources. And essentially, it's a collective reading of the system across social, political, economic, all the different factors. So you can begin to see together where information may not be flowing, or where something that seems maybe a threat or of no use suddenly could become an opportunity. So it's also a bit like a remix, really, of what already exists, but you need to really know what already exists. I also work on a very inside out as opposed to top down or bottom up. I think within that process, you're continually scaling up and down between tactic and strategy. Very different, you know, they're kind of power positions. They have different knowledges and expertise. And I think that also then facilitates a more circular form of leadership, because there may be different skills, different knowledge, different expertise required at different kind of stages or different positions in a process. And I think when I was doing my undergrad in the early 90s, I chose arts therapy as my sort of professional practice. And one of the things, and at that time it was like, oh yeah, it was saying that sometimes the best thing is to do nothing. And so I think I then developed this idea of a life cycle analysis of any intervention, because I do think there's definitely opportunities and merit and value in quicker or lighter touch, or what has been called lighter, quicker, cheaper. But I also have concerns around that, because, you know, lighter, quicker, cheaper in equity, in environmental justice, and so again the kind of deeper, richer, slower it has importance. So it's constantly scaling, and really it is quite messy. And it can be chaotic, but I think this is where I began, after maybe 20 plus years, to start to look at what could be effective tools and processes that can offer a sort of like a container that can help hold that messiness, that chaos, that complexity, and really begin to tease out the more effective or the more useful bits. So that's kind of a broad overarching of a first step. But it was the resources or the tools that I used. They were, you know, as I said, I analyzed kind of 50 years of practice, particularly artistic practice. And when I say artistic practice, I want to be clear, video arts. I'm not talking traditional, conventional artistic practice, which I value and has a place in the world, but that's not the type of art practices I was looking at. I was looking at these more agile, more looking at collaborative problem solving, participatory, socially engaged practices, to see the best of practices and impact. I really looked at impact as well, and then was reverse engineering a set of tools that I hope are useful. And we've just spent the last 2 to 3 years working within a very specific community to look at how we can make those tools where myself and others become more and more redundant in the process.
Thank you so much, Anita, for the insights into your practice and your perspectives. Tom and then David wanted to add something. Please go ahead.
Oh, this is just terrific to listen to both of you. There's so much interesting things to respond to, but I'll pick up on a few. And Anita, your training in art therapy really wrong. I do not have training in art therapy. I don't think I've ever taken a psychology class even, but I was one member of a community. One time I was working in over an extended period of time, and I was going back and forth and talking to various people, and he said, "You're kind of like a community therapist." And I was like, oh my God, I never thought of myself in that way, and I didn't really feel equipped. But I think that is part of the work, whether we like to think of that or not. And I heard a lot in Anita's comments about horizontal networks. I mean, starting with the permaculture, and it's like, okay, let's learn from that practice and bring it across into this practice, and that's where innovation often comes from. But this horizontal network building and learning across sectors is so important. And David's talk about, I mean, there's a practice, tactical urbanism, some people have called it, it's called some other things, but this kind of rapid prototyping of ways to engage people and to do iterative changes in communities, I think is really a wonderful practice. And in spite of David's aversion to committee meetings and so on, I did hear relationship building going on through the process of David's approach. And I think that's one thing I tried to make that point earlier in my presentation, that a lot of planners and community developers, they're so focused on the physical aspects of community that they forget about the very importance of the relational parts, and that people building this capacity to act together, which David's approach does beautifully. It builds on people's capacity to co-create and to work together and to take action. And that in itself, I think, is really valuable kind of work.
Thank you, Tom. David, did you want to add something?
Yes. So first of all, a lot of tactical urbanism tends to be very temporary, fiddling at the edges kind of stuff. But what we seek to do is to have the community create things that in 30 years' time, they'll be fighting to preserve. So we have a real emphasis on giving them something solid that is going to stand the test of time. And just to pick up on Tom's comments, the local government tell us that the most valuable thing that comes out of this is the community networks that are built. And I say that happens while people are working together with a pick and shovel or whatever it happens to be. But I want to throw one other thing into the mix that I think is absolutely, and it picks up a bit on Anita's point about being an art therapist. I call myself a space psychologist. So what fascinates me is how the arrangement of public spaces impact the psychology of communities. Now, what I believe the most limiting factor for any community is not the physical infrastructure around them, but the stories that they tell about that physicality. So, for example, we go into one town that has a major highway up the center of the main shopping street. And the retailers all say, the thing that's killing our town is the highway and all the busy traffic that's on that highway that's dividing our town centre in half. Now, I knew that before they even said it, because I could see that every one of them had psychologically given up on the public space outside of their shop. I could tell that by the way they were relating to the public space. So I had to say to them, that town story is what is killing your town. It's not the traffic, it's the story you're telling about the traffic that is killing your town, because that story is then determining how you as a town act. So he said, you have to change your town story to, that traffic is the most valuable commodity we've got. Inside of every one of those cars is a potential customer, and it's our job to get that car to stop and for that customer to engage with the retailers in our town centre. So one of our primary things is always about reading what are the stories that are strangling or limiting that town. Just one other quick example, and this one happens all the time. So I've built a park in my backyard as a demonstration of how to use private land for public good. And one of the things that happened was I put $2,000 worth of furniture on the first thing I built was a giant deck under a tree. And one night I went out and there's a lady sitting in the chair, and she said, you know, you've started a big debate in our community. I said, what's that? She said, 50% of us think this furniture won't last more than a week, and 50% of us think that it will last. And I said to myself, it was worth spending $2,000 just to start that discussion in my community. Because now 4 years later, when that furniture is still there, I've altered the story that my community is telling itself about itself. And to me, that is the most valuable outcome you can do with anything in the physical space, is about lifting people's perceptions of their capabilities, the perceptions of the capabilities of that community, to remove the stories. You know, we get it all the time. If we say to a community, let's put loose furniture in this space we've just created, they go, oh no, we can't do that, they'll get stolen. And I go, how do you know? Have you ever done it? Have you ever tried it? So what limits people is these stories, these belief systems that they've built up. And I think, Tom, that's a lot about what I would see as the culture of a place, is these underlying stories that nobody ever bothers to articulate, which become the ball and chain that stops those communities from really growing. And as a placemaker, I see that as my primary responsibility.
Absolutely. I think the narratives are crucial. It's not only the built environment, but how we talk about the built environment makes a huge difference. I wanted to come to one question, and then Anita, I'm going back to you. Why do you think, Thomas raised this point also, why do you think city planning and like cultural planning in most cities are two different spheres completely? They have hardly anything to do. They don't talk to each other. Sometimes they hardly know of each other. Even in a city like, I'm head of the Cultural Urban Development Department here at Mannheim. So it's kind of a unique structure that we're trying to implement here in Mannheim to bring culture and planning together in some way or form. And I guess you could call us, in a way, connectors, as Charles Landry calls them, or, Thomas said the horizontal structures. But sometimes I wonder, are we overburdening these connectors? Because ultimately they hardly ever have power in terms of decision-making power. How do we make sure that this horizontal structures really work and are implemented and do not only rely on single people who might try to do a lot, but ultimately might not be able to move a lot because of the structures and the hierarchies that are in the way? Any thoughts on this?
You asking me?
Tom and Anita and David, for all of you.
Chapter 2 of my book is all about your first question of why are these two, city planning, cultural planning, so often done separately, and in some cases don't even talk to each other. And I mean, there's just a lot of reasons, but in the history of the the way the arts and culture are seen in communities, they're fluff. They're sort of like, oh, well, that's the icing on the cake. You know, we don't have time for that. We're talking about serious stuff here, like sewer and waters and roadways and town centers and so on. I think the planning profession has come around a bit to understanding some of the value, and it's a big reason I wrote that book was to try to bring these two practices closer together, because I think there's a lot that city planners can learn about the culture of their community, about the people and how they behave and act, and what the kinds of things that they enjoy doing, but also need to do for their sort of, you know, social connections and enrichment. And they're not talking to each other. And there's a male-female dynamic. The arts are seen as this sort of more feminine practice. And when you look at the people who work in the arts organizations and agencies, it's predominantly women. And when you look at people in the city planning and architecture, design fields, it's predominantly men. So, I mean, there's so many like strange reasons for that division that I hope gets overcome. And I forget the second part of your question, but I'll let someone else take that on.
Yeah. It was Anita and David. Do you see any remedies to this situation? Because it seems to be in place in almost all of the cities that I've encountered, that I know, that these two spheres, city planning and cultural planning, or culture in general, are considered to be, two different silos, if you will, two different spheres. How do we cut across these spheres, and how do we make it more productive in terms of placemaking, but also in terms of urban development in general?
Shall I go?
Yeah. Please.
So I think, you know, it has been mentioned before about the silos, and I think there's a huge aspect in terms of training and interdisciplinary practices, transdisciplinary. I also think, you know, just in terms of, I felt compelled to make the distinction earlier when I was talking about artistic practice or creative practice. It wasn't a studio-based approach. And I think Tom sort of referenced that in terms of the perception of what the arts are and can be. You know, I think there is also, on top of the fluff and, you know, oh, you know, that's not me, I think there's also this still ongoing that the arts are, you know, somewhat self-expressive. They're maybe not, there's an innate talent or genius involved. And I think where I try and work from is the perspective of the skills and competencies that come from within that discipline or that training. I think also in terms of, and you know, obviously I can only speak from my experience when talking to perhaps planners about cultural planning, and I start talking about possibilities and potentials and sharing examples of good practices or precedents, there again, there is this, oh, I didn't know that. I didn't think of that, you know, and I think that kind of adds to a separation. I think also sometimes finding shared language and common values, you know, when you begin people in a room, sometimes you'll spend a lot of time using similar words and terms, but they mean entirely different things to both of you. So I think really trying to facilitate space where that the place for shared objectives and shared aims, as well as sharing what has worked and other possibilities, could be a way towards that. I also, something I'd like to reference here in Ireland, big up, we have a relatively new sort of last 5 to 6 years so, and it's called Creative Ireland. And what I find particularly exciting about the potential of that is every local authority, so every municipality has a Creative Ireland team, and that team is made up of representatives sort of across governance departments. So you'll have people from utilities, from heritage, from language, and the idea is, and it is led by the Arts Office usually, but the idea is that is an opportunity to really begin to share practices and maybe have more collaborative crossover, even as simple as information sharing, what's going on in what department. I think we all know, and I think David referenced it there with the furniture in his garden, just sometimes initiating the conversation between people who may not have that conversation actually then sort of sets off an emergent kind of process that is dynamic and will have a momentum.
Thanks, Anita. David, did you want to add something?
Oh, I got so much to add. The whole issue of why we have silos would be a whole nother session that we'd need half a day to discuss. But just briefly, it comes out of the Industrial Revolution, which changed the entire way that we look at the world. We now look at the world in very mechanical terms, and we've started looking at our cities in mechanical terms. We thought we could master plan them. We treated them like they were a machine that we could optimize. And to do that, we had experts who looked after various bits of that machine. So I think there's a worldview that stands behind why the reality of the stories that we tell have given us the reality that we've got, which is silos. Silos are not an accident. They're a result of the stories we tell about or the way that we view the world. The other thing I'd like to say about the silos, though, is what I find fascinating is that if you get to know some of the very straight-laced people stuck in the planning silo, for example, you find out that they play saxophone in a nightclub. I argue that every human being is an artist. It's just that many of us are forced to lock up the artist, and planners tend to adopt a certain persona. And this happens with all workers, say in LGA. I say that every one of them hangs up their everyday life on a hook outside of the workspace and put on a pair of overalls or a dress that is the role that they are now going to inhabit for the next 8 hours. And they leave all of their everyday life experience behind at that point and don't integrate it into the profession. So I think the big cultural shift is how do we get people to bring their entire selves, their entire lives into the workplace? I argue it's a waste of time doing community consultation when every person in a council organisation is a community member with a life experience. You know, there are already people with disabilities working within that organisation, et cetera, et cetera. But let me just outline one mechanism that we use to break the existing silos and systems down. So we can't do a 7-day makeover, or a lot of our other systems in working, say, with retailers, we can't do under a regulatory approach, which is how local government is structured. So for a 7-day makeover, we can't go and lodge a permit to build something or do something. So we are moving councils from what we call a regulatory approach to a permissions approach. And about a month before we do the 7-day makeover, we draw up a document which is for a 7-day makeover. It's called the What is Allowed document. And it can be no longer than 1 page. And this is the framework that the community can work within, so they can look at that and go, oh, we're not allowed to do that, but we're allowed to do that. But it creates a field of play. So rather than saying you must come back to us to get permission to do X, Y, or Z, now that scares the living out of the bureaucrats. They see the common sense in it, and I can tell you, we in the 7 days will run into all sorts of difficulties because they start panicking when, in theory, this permission statement sounded so great, but when they start seeing the community doing some of the things that they're allowed to do within that, then they freak out. But it's a way of we say we want to give both the bureaucracy and the community an experience of a different way of doing business. And I think it's through that we start to shift the culture.
Thank you, David. Anita, did you want to add something directly? And then Tom. Yep. Your mic, Anita, still off.
Sorry, you think I know that after nearly 2 years? Coming on from what both David and Tom has said before, this notion of narrative and stories and dominant stories, it's also about the story about ourselves and what is possible and what we can do in place. And I think the other thing coming from that permissions, and where I think you can start with an intervention and then grow it to a more longer term, is the notion of managed risk. I think this is a really important, you know, as has been mentioned, that won't work, why not? And then everybody gives all the negative and the problems about why it won't work. Whereas actually to reverse engineer and upfront go, okay, what are the problems? Let's get them all out on the table. Let's go to the point of where there's going to be a blockage. Open that out and go, let's reverse engineer a quick process that can manage some of those risks. Because I think coming back to, say, the psychology or the space therapy or whatever it is, one of the things that I think we're going to have to increasingly engage with is we have a very old operating system internally. As soon as we sense a threat or perceive a danger, we automatically kick in. You know, our amygdala, our limbic system starts to take over, and it only takes milliseconds. So we have to, I think, begin to recognize that we're all operating, no matter our profession, no matter what we're bringing into the room, we are all operating with that very strong underlying process that once it triggers and our frontal cortex goes offline, we actually don't have choice in the way that we might understand choice. And so I think kind of, you know, creating a space where fear or perception of threat can be managed is also another important aspect of placemaking. And I think I would see the projects or the way that I strive to work is it's creating that safer space where risk can be managed, where we can begin to reimagine and tell ourselves new stories, not only about the place, but about how we can also interact and operate. And, you know, it's the positive side of a boundary is I grew up in a highly segregated community in Northern Ireland in the 1970s and 80s, where one of the most political things you could ask somebody is where from. Because as soon as you said that, there was a whole ripple effect of assumptions and knowledge. And again, I think if we create spaces and projects where they have a safe boundary, where some things are that at the door in the space of this project or this process, and try and encourage modes of operation that enable people to leave stuff at the door as well as bring their best selves into the room and all the knowledge and expertise they may have.
Thank you, Anita. Tom, please go ahead.
So many things. Again, this is such a rich discussion. But so starting with Anita's kind of description of sort of our DNA of how we function, our culture, our organizational cultures, and how do we change those? That's one of the things that a lot of corporations and businesses. How do we change our internal culture to do things differently? And that's one of the biggest challenges that we have. And to pick up too on the stories are how we build our culture and how we understand ourselves and those around us. So I want to thank both of you for reinforcing the idea of the importance of story in this work. And Anita's, I forget the term you used exactly. We're talking about you're not top down, bottom up, but maybe inside, outside, whatever the, but it's a both and kind of approach. I think that's really important in creating change, and David's interventions that show people how to do something differently when it's complemented with some longer term systems change and thinking. I mean, together those are really powerful. And I just wanted to quickly mention in my city here in Minneapolis, there's a program with the city government, and it started from an outside nonprofit arts center that I was the director of for 22 years, but had left when it continued to do this work. And it started a program with the city government called Creative Placemaking, and of course, building on Charles Landry's terminology. And the Creative Placemaking project has continued now for many years. It's been fully adopted into the city, in which they bring artists in, and I think it's the flip side of what Anita was describing with the cross agency in the city. But they bring artists in who are selected, of course, because they're well prepared and equipped to then go and work in different departments. They work in housing inspections. They did a whole transformation of the way the housing inspections people think about their work and go about doing it. And they work in city planning and in economic development and public works and so on. And so they're placing artists in different agencies within the city over a period of a year or sometimes longer, to be these kind of nanites in the system to try to like make this little cultural changes inside the system. So it takes all of these inside, outside, top down, bottom up approaches. So there's lots of us around the world who are trying similar things and hopefully making some headway.
Thank you, Tom. I wanted to pick up on one point that you mentioned, that artists and creatives are so essential for urban development and for placemaking projects ultimately. I was wondering if we could talk a little bit about the role of aesthetics or aesthetic experience in facilitating placemaking projects, and also perhaps what the role of aesthetics could be for democracy or democratic processes, which placemaking processes ultimately also are or should be. What is the particular role of aesthetic experience? What does it afford us that perhaps other realms cannot do? And what makes it special in this regard, perhaps? Anita.
So I would instantly be going, we possibly need to reframe what we mean by aesthetics. I think for me, aesthetics is not just about formal qualities or ideas of beauty and the more traditional forms. I mean, I think, if I look at something that I know is heavily toxic in the back end, whether it's to do with maybe the resources it's using, its outputs or whatever, I personally cannot accept that within my aesthetic framing. I don't see it as having aesthetic qualities. So I think there's also a discussion to be had around that, because also, beauty is so subjective. And I think where that then can manifest within a city, it can, perpetuate exclusion and people not seeing themselves represented or their values or aesthetic notions within the city. So I think it's quite a difficult term, and I think going forward, really maybe expanding it to include aspects around its low environmental impact or its high social justice, or may be an avenue worth exploring more.
I guess when I said aesthetics, it doesn't necessarily only entail the beautiful and the non-functional and all of these things, that we tend to associate with high culture and high art. But I'm coming more from an actually American pragmatist perspective, say like John Dewey or someone like that, who said that aesthetic experiences are very essential because they're ultimately platforms for dialogue, for citizenship, for engaging with other people about what it felt like, what we think of the piece, what we, what changed in us during the process of watching a piece or a movie or listen to music, for instance. So I was just trying to find out, is there something particular about the aesthetic experience, and not necessarily only what we consider the ultimate universal, beautiful, etc., but why do we tend to employ aesthetic experience with placemaking projects or creative placemaking? What is the big advantage here, and what can other realms perhaps not do as effectively as the artistic realm can?
Chapter 8 in my book on this topic, but I had just a story. I've done a lot of talks and so on and visits in South Korea, and when I use the term aesthetics in South Korea, they think of facelifts, and I mean that term is used to talk about sort of managing the the body, the face. So I had to find a different. But I at the same time I was talking about toxic masculinity in the built environment, and they clicked with that like right away. Said, "Wow, there's a lot of discussion here in South Korea about this idea of," they didn't have the term exactly toxic masculinity, but about the male dominance in the environment and how that's destructive and so on. So I think the aesthetics in the built and the designed and built environment, I think, are really important, especially in communities like mine or in the United States, where there are very diverse cultures living together and sharing space. And who sees themselves in the built environment? Is this there's a real interesting line of thinking around white space, and that white people have kind of created this design aesthetic in the built environment that is very comfortable for white people. But for people of color, people from other parts of the world who may come into that space, they're like, I don't see myself in this space, in this environment. So there's a wonderful Finnish scholar, Hanna Mattila, who has written about aesthetic equity and aesthetic justice, and how is the built environment, how can the built environment have and express a sort of an aesthetic justice where people see and feel themselves in that built environment. A very complex thing, of course, and her conclusion is that it's really a process. It's an ongoing process of people being involved in the design and construction of the built environment. So it's long-term, of course, but with what I'm seeing in my neighborhood now, since the George Floyd murder and the burning down of so much of the built environment, is a proliferation of murals. So there are artists out painting murals. I mean, they were out immediately with spray cans on plywood, but now there are some longer term murals being painted up and down the street, so that people are starting to have a sense of feeling themselves and their issues, things that are important to them in the physical, designed, or aesthetic environment. So it's a complex thing that has many arms and legs, with our sort of toxic masculinity, with so many architects and designers over the last couple of centuries being men and only men, and having this sort of dominant aesthetic in the built environment, and how that's starting to change. Feminism has really started to open that up, and then the other movements of people of color in the community saying, hey, this doesn't reflect who I am. So anyway, it's a fascinating and a very long topic to discuss.
David and Nita, I think, wanted to add something as well.
So when I'm teaching placemaking, I describe placemaking as being like homemaking, where a homemaker takes a house and turns it into a home. And I get people to do an exercise, which is, if you walk into somebody's home and you instantly feel at home, what is it that makes you feel at home? Now, when I do that exercise, I've never had anybody, including design professionals, say that what makes them feel at home is that they employed a top-notch interior designer to make over that space. And so people talk about things other than having, a top line. Back in the 70s, I had two friends who were the poorest people in the world, but they had the most welcoming home. And I say to communities all the time, poor people are often better homemakers than rich people. because what they're forced to do is rely on their resourcefulness. They can't buy, you know, they can't buy aesthetic beauty. They have to create it out of the dirt. So I think a lot of aesthetics is what I would call design-centric aesthetics. So a lot of placemaking is still design-centric. I say the only people who've benefited from the emergence of placemaking as a profession have been the people who print business cards, because every designer in the world has gone and thrown their cards out and got placemaker along with everything else that's on their business card. So I put it this way. I'm a passionate artist and sculptor, but I will argue that design is the carriage on the back of the placemaking train. It is not the engine driving the train. So there is an absolutely essential part. You know, when we do 7-day makeovers, I'm all about creating great design as part of that. But your end goal is to make people be emotionally connected to that space and feel emotionally connected when they walk into it. That's your end goal. It's not the aesthetics, it's not the design, although aesthetics and design are an important part of doing that. But so you've got to keep in mind, what's the engine driving this train? And if you're talking about placemaking, it is how do you make people feel like this is part of their home territory? This is where they belong. They've got a psychological connection to this space, as opposed to, does it just look beautiful and will that solicit certain responses from people?
I'm sorry, not to cut off Anita, but David, it's so funny because I have a presentation on this very topic, and I start out with people's homes and how they make their homes feel welcoming and comfortable to others. And it's so interesting to hear you say that, because I have the same approach.
Yeah.
Anita, please.
I guess the only two things I think both Tom and David sort of followed on from what I was saying about aesthetics. And I think, you know, one of the very sort of deep underpinnings of the process that I work with and that was developed and is in constant, you know, iteration is oikos, which from the is kind of home.
Could you repeat it, Anita? We had a little lag there. Could you just repeat the last sentence?
Oikos, O-I-K-O-S, from the Greek. And it's also the root of ecology and economics, interestingly enough. And I think that idea of belonging and a sense of seeing yourself represented, being comfortable, not excluded, not triggered, is really critical. And I think for me, on a very, very simple term, the clue in the name, it's a progressive verb, placemaking. It's ongoing, it's generative, and it's processual. So I think that's a really key, you know, not as David was saying, and Tom, not to be led by design. Design is a critical part of it, but it has to be this more balanced, integrated approach.
I guess what I was aiming at more than the built environment was really, you know, how to, I mean, a lot of times creative placemakers incorporate artists in the process and facilitate the process through in artistic ways, be it music or film, moving images, or other performances, for instance. So I think I was aiming more at this tactical intervention, what that can afford us in order to perhaps change the narrative of a place, or afford us a place of imagination where we totally reimagine a place through aesthetics and through aesthetic means. So of course, I would completely agree with what's been said, but I still think it's very interesting to think about the role of artists and creatives in these placemaking efforts as facilitators of new experiences and sort of also the recoding of places, for instance. Anita, sorry. rambling on.
I think it comes back to what I was saying when I felt compelled to make a distinction about the type of artistic process and practice and the skills and competencies as opposed to the output. I mean, I think you know, one of my great go-tos is Frances Whitehead's "What Artists Know." And I think that really lays out the skills that can be brought into the process, right from disruption to synthesizing diverse kind of knowledge sets, to remixing, to reimagining. I think as well, you know, the idea of one of the things I was lucky enough to be part of a symposium that was artists and scientists together. And when we actually talked about it, we were sort of envious of each other, because as artists, we had whether we, you know, we took that ownership. If we were working towards something and we could see clearly it wasn't working, we had the competence, confidence, maybe even the arrogance to go, there's no point in doing that. It's not. And start moving forward. Whereas a more static process is like, oh, we have to show why it doesn't work. And so again, I think that's part of the potential of artists within this process. And artists, you know, it's such a singular word that comes with so many. I think creatives maybe is a better, or a creative process, creative collaboration. And just something that I wanted to bring in back in. Sure.
There's a lag again, Anita. Sorry, we couldn't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
In 2014, I analysed in the literature the role of. At that point, I find 15 distinct roles that had been named, both in practice as well as in the literature, that artists kind of take up, whether it was activist, citizen, catalyst, civilizer, collaborator, educator, disruptor, negotiator, mediator. You know, it was a very extensive list. And again, I think that is something to do potentially with the training and framing of that profession. I don't know.
Thank you very much, Anita. One final question, and I would like all of you to answer it very, very briefly. Do you think that public space is going to be increasingly contested in the future? And what sort of remedies can placemaking offer in this regard, if that should be the case? 3 very quick answers because our time is running out. David, Tom, Anita, who wants to start? Go ahead.
I mean, I think the short answer is yes. All space is going to be contested, I think, in terms of where we're heading. And I think, you know, really we're back to that approach, able to kind of regulate and not operate from places of fear and threat. Now, that's very easy to say. As to how that will happen, I think it's an ongoing process.
Thank you, Tom.
Yeah, absolutely. The answer is yes. And what we're seeing here in the US anyway, with the increase in climate refugees, people fleeing, and there will be so many more people needing to find a safer place to be. And plus we have an incredibly outrageous problem with people with no homes. So we have homeless people camping on the sides of the streets and in the public parks and various places. And it's a intractable problem that's just anyway. So the answer is yes. Public space will be increasingly contested.
David, any final thoughts?
Sure, I agree that it will be contested, but the very nature of placemaking is about creating spaces in which everybody feels at home and is connected to that space. The challenge, I'd like to throw a challenge out though, when we're talking about public space, because we tend to think of that as the parks, the streets, the sidewalks that are controlled by the local government. I have long argued that what each of us does with our private land has more impact on the vitality of the public realm than anything a local government authority can do. Every time one of us puts up an 8-foot-high fence or puts a garage on the front of our building or whatever, the attitude to private land is what makes public space so contested. The idea that I actually own the land that we stole off of the Aboriginals 200 years ago, I find offensive. And so my attitude is I've taken down my fences and I've turned my entire property into a public park because I don't own it. And it should be a place of community building, and not something that's debasing the sense of neighborhood and the sense of community. So I think we all have the power to create our own, even if you leave your front fence up and you just put a seat outside of your front fence, you're building community. If you put a book library there are a million ways that we as citizens can create great public spaces without going to our local government authorities and saying, you must do it for us.
Absolutely agree. Thank you so much, David. I think this is a wonderful final statement, reminding us all that we're all placemakers all the time, that we're all creating the spaces that we live in and that we share together. And I want to really thank you all very, very much for joining us today for this final session of our International Placemaking Forum Mannheim. Anita, Tom, David, thank you so much for this wonderful discussion. I've certainly learned a lot. I think the viewers have too. We have recorded this and are going to share this, and we'll let you know about it. Thank you all very, very much, and take care.